What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I've been gradually continuing my Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster journey, which now brings us to Final Fantasy V. Back when I first delved into the older Final Fantasy titles in 2020, Final Fantasy V was the one that I had played the least of before dropping it. But now coming off of 100%ing the achievement list for Final Fantasy V, I am very much of two minds about this game. One being that as a casual experience, I think this game is great. If I didn't feel pressured to 100% it since I had already done the previous 4 games, I think I would have enjoyed it quite a bit more. You can probably infer that the other side of this is that 100%ing this game very much felt like a chore at times, far more than the previous games. While I do want to talk about certain aspects of 100%ing this game later on in the video, I do want to try to dial that back and focus on the core experience, because I think this game deserves a lot more credit. In the West, it's understandable that this game tends to not come up as much when talking about the best entries in the series, because it didn't release in the West back when it was new. And so I think by virtue of that, it tends to kind of get lost in the shuffle when discussing Final Fantasy games. Let's break down the various aspects of Final Fantasy V as I like to do, though I'm going to do my best to avoid major spoilers because I think it is feasible to talk about this game's story and characters in broad strokes without spoiling things majorly, though of course playing games like these blind is usually the better experience. In my exposure to Final Fantasy V prior to playing it in full, my perception of this game's story was that it wasn't really anything to write home about. It maybe appeared to be the type of game story in which attempts at comic relief undermine the more serious components to the story. Contrary to my external perception of this game, I actually think the story does take itself seriously for the vast majority of its runtime, and is very reminiscent of FF4, which makes sense. It very much shares that approach to storytelling generally, where you have a much more overt plot setup, more distinctly characterized characters that each have individual arcs to certain extents. I just didn't expect that because almost every time I've heard this game talked about in passing, it's, oh, the job system and the gameplay is great, but the story is whatever. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's the greatest narrative of all time, let alone in the series, but I think that perspective is doing this game's story a disservice because I think there is a lot here to like. My point before about comic relief undermining the more serious elements, while I don't think that is totally fair to this game's story, I do see where people are coming from with that perspective. There are, especially in the early hours of the game, many attempts at comic relief. These are very hit or miss. I wouldn't say that any of them actually made me laugh in the traditional sense, but I found it oftentimes heartwarming and that it added something positive to the group dynamic whenever there was an attempt at comedy, which is something that's not really present in FF4 before it. Final Fantasy IV takes itself extremely seriously, but I think that makes some of the characters in that game feel very stiff, whereas FF5's characters feel at least a little bit more convincing because they have those lighter moments of humor, if you want to call it that. Presentation-wise, there's only so much you can really do because these sprites, while they have some facial expressions, it's mostly them sliding around the room to certain extents, and it just doesn't always translate. And I could see why some people would roll their eyes at a lot of the attempted comedy. While there is more to this story than just go restore the crystals or prevent the crystals from being stolen or whatever somewhat generic crystal stories have been told previously, the crystals, while important to the plot in moments later on, seem more or less to me like a narrative justification for certain gameplay systems, which I'll get into later, though they are the crux for at least the first act of the game, because I think you can conceivably perceive this game as being in 3 acts. That's why I think just taking this game, at least at first, as a pure adventure is the best way to go about it, not necessarily looking for more intriguing plot elements until later on. That's not to say there aren't moments with high stakes or emotional moments early on that help to flesh out this cast of characters. So pivoting into the characters in Final Fantasy V, we of course have Bartz, Lenna, Galuf, and Ferris. While none of them have as grand of an arc as Cecil from Final Fantasy IV, for instance, they do at least have somewhat distinct personalities. Bartz is kind of a goofball who gradually learns to take things seriously. Lenna's kind of the timid, kind one who learns to be able to do things on her own at a certain point. Galuf is kind of an older figure in the group, and so it's hard for me to say that he has an arc that doesn't just revolve around his amnesia, which which I do find to be kind of a cop-out plot device. It works okay here, but there are a lot of moments early on in the game that rely on Galuf being an amnesiac that I think could have been explained in a way that, for one, avoids that trope, but also would make equally as much sense. Like early on when there's a siren who's trying to lure these four in, and because Galuf has amnesia, he doesn't recognize the person that is trying to lure him in, so he doesn't fall for it and is able to rescue the other three. I feel like it would have been more interesting if, instead of the amnesia angle, maybe he wasn't trusting of the other three at first and therefore kept certain information from them, and or he had a strong enough will to not fall for the siren's song and various other points in the story where the amnesia comes up. And I felt this especially the more I thought about it, because there are other characters in a similar position to Galuf that don't have amnesia, and so it's like, why did he in particular need to be an amnesiac? It's fine, especially because past the first act it's not super relevant anymore, but there could have been so many other much more interesting ways to approach his character early on. And then Ferris is kind of a mystery at first, a pirate captain, and therefore kind of prickly, especially when it comes to opening up to the other three. But Ferris does gradually learn to open up to the others in various ways. So yeah, overall, these four are definitely not the deepest characters in the series, but I do quite like them and did enjoy the group dynamic, maybe even more so than Final Fantasy IV. Although in that game you are rotating party members constantly, and the stakes are perceivably a lot higher from the get-go. It does make sense that they are very much all business all the time. There's not really a lot of time for camaraderie and bonding and whatnot. Whereas in this game, while the first act does have those more high-stakes moments, as I mentioned, it's not really until the second act that the story starts to focus and dial in on the particular task at hand. Let's talk about the world of Final Fantasy V a little bit. And I say a little bit because talking about the world of Final Fantasy V too much would actually involve spoilers pretty heavily. What I can say is that it begins in a very familiar fantasy-style setting, as you might have come to expect playing the previous games. As far as exploration is concerned, hidden items were cut way back from the previous games. In FF3 and 4, I feel like almost every town at least had one, if not multiple, hidden items. Whereas in this game, there's many towns that have nothing to find in that same way. The other thing is the dungeons in this game were quite enjoyable. They actually had some light traversal and puzzle solving that I very much appreciated, because that's something that I tend to look for in games with dungeons. Now moving into the real meat of Final Fantasy V, which of course is the gameplay and its systems. This game once again uses the active time battle system for its battles, so you've got the meter that gradually fills up, at which point you can select that character's action for that turn, in addition to enemies and bosses of course having hidden ATB meters that they abide by. I did play this game pretty much entirely with the battles set to very fast, and the battle messages set to very fast. The battle messages are still pretty damn slow though in my opinion, but the battles themselves did move pretty quickly, so quickly in fact that there were some optional enemies and bosses later on that I dialed the speed back to not give the enemy too much of an edge, because any little time you're spending between menus, even on wait mode, is time that is filling up the enemy's ATB. So keeping it slower, while it does affect both sides of the field, can help you out, especially against some of these late game optional bosses. Although I will say that there was far less form changing in the boss fights in this game compared to Final Fantasy IV. Although, to compensate for that, I actually found a lot of the encounters in this game, particularly forced encounters like bosses, to require a lot more strategy than before as far as your team composition. And so that brings me into the major gameplay component to Final Fantasy V, which is the return of the job system from Final Fantasy III. Your main party of four don't have set classes. They do all start as freelancers, but as you acquire sets of jobs, you can assign them to these different jobs however you like. Though instead of simply altering which abilities you have with your current job equipped, as you level up these jobs by acquiring ABP or ability points, which is like a secondary form of experience you get from enemy and boss encounters, you learn various abilities at certain job levels, which you can then equip regardless of what job you have active at that time. So this allows you to essentially mix and match different abilities for different situations. There's a lot of experimentation present here, and I think that a lot of it is heavily encouraged by a lot of the mandatory encounters, primarily bosses. But those boss fights that do require you to strategize a little bit more aren't as cut and dry as just equip the Dragoon class to everybody and spam the jump command like that one fight in Final Fantasy III. Now, what I will say is that the accrual of ability points is very slow. I kept all the boosters at just 1 times for the opening hours of the game, but because there was an achievement for mastering all of the jobs in the game, which there are, I want to say 22 of, I realized very quickly that I was going to want the booster for ABP to be maxed out. I don't feel like it broke the game really at all, because I still had to grind pretty heavily at times to master a lot of these jobs. Now, you definitely don't need to master all of the jobs to beat the game, but what I will say is that when a character masters a particular job, that then gives the freelancer job a permanent passive ability based on whatever jobs you have mastered. And so eventually by the end of the game, if you've mastered many of the jobs, if not all of them, then the freelancer class ends up being extremely powerful by virtue of that. Which I guess this will bring me into some of the 100% conversation. This game took me a little over 30 hours to 100%, which is significantly more than the previous game, Final Fantasy IV, which took me not even 20 hours, and the games prior to that even less. I say the first act went pretty smoothly as far as following a missable guide that I found on Steam, but then once I got to the second act of the game was when I really started to feel overwhelmed and nervous that I was going to miss something, or that I had already missed something, at which point I actually pivoted over to a different missable guide. And so I was kind of like comparing and bouncing between these two different guides to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. And the main reason for that is a lot of these achievements you have to do on a single playthrough. It's not like the bestiary where completion of it applies to all saves and all playthroughs, so you can kind of jump around saves or complete it on a following playthrough or something. If I were to have missed hitting 100% on this first play, then what for my second play, right? Then I'm stressing out again trying to 100% it on that file. And maybe there are some things that I could ignore because I 100%ed that component on the first playthrough. But now that the 100% achievement side of things is over with, I feel like whenever I revisit this game, not feeling pressured to see and do absolutely everything is going to make it a lot more enjoyable. More often than not, I'll do my first playthrough of a game without worrying about achievements at all. It's just with these pixel remasters in particular, it's kind of just a trend that I started with the first game, and it was very achievable and not super stressful for the first few. And so I wanted to continue that so that way I could 100% all 6 of these sequentially. Since I had already done 4 of them to this point, why not do the last 2? And this one was by far the most daunting. I think it did at times sour my opinion of it a little bit unfairly. So I would say unless you are, like I have been, dead set on 100%ing each of these games, I would recommend actually not doing it for this game especially. That's part of the benefit to playing these games on Switch, I'm sure. Since there is no achievement system, I feel like any and all pressure there could be to 100% is pretty much alleviated, unless you are just a completionist at heart. But when it comes to playing on Steam, I historically have not paid achievements very much mind on first runs. I will say that part of what added to the stress and the tension of the mid to late game of this 100% playthrough was that there's just a long stretch where you're not proccing any achievements, but there's so many of them left to do because there's so many that require you to get all of a certain thing, right? 100% the bestiary, get 100% of the chests, learn all the kinds of blue magic, master all the jobs, travel to all the map locations. And so once I reached the final hours of the game and I started seeing these achievements proc, it was very cathartic and ultimately made me feel glad that I decided to 100% this game. It's just that in the heat of the moment, it was actually getting on my nerves for a good number of hours, particularly finding some of these rarer enemies, especially if there was a blue magic spell involved, because some of the setup required to get some of these blue spells can be pretty convoluted and frustrating when things don't go your way in a particular encounter and then you have to find them again and try to execute the same plan. But overall, Final Fantasy V is really a great game. The story was more compelling than I expected, with characters that, while not the most fleshed out in the world, I quite enjoyed. There were a good number of emotional moments that, while they maybe didn't evoke tangible emotion in me, were scenes where I was fully captivated by what was happening, and I actually bought into a lot of those moments, especially because certain emotional events in this game have tangible and permanent repercussions. And you add to this the very dynamic and customizable upgrade of the job system from Final Fantasy III, with encounters that actually require you to make use of said flexibility, but not too much to make it feel rigid. It's very much a game that I could see myself coming back to in the future, especially because I recently discovered the Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta, which is kind of like this fundraising challenge thing that's held every year. It seems like a very neat way to approach potential future runs of this game without having to sweat 100%ing it. Although I will say, because I did go for 100%, there were a good number of blue magic spells and things that I maybe wouldn't have acquired otherwise that were very useful a lot of the time. And so I think this particular playthrough was a good learning experience for where to acquire a lot of these things for the sake of my future playthroughs. But yeah, I would definitely say that if you have not played Final Fantasy V, I would very much encourage you to give it a shot if you have written it off previously or hadn't bothered to check it out, because it tends to get overshadowed in conversation by Final Fantasy IV and VI, especially here in the West. I've now gone through each of the first 9 Final Fantasies at least once, if not twice, twice in some cases. I'm very much looking forward to replaying Final Fantasy VI via the Pixel Remaster. I'll save many of my thoughts for the eventual video on that game once I go through the 100% process with it. I do, of course, want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.